Hello and welcome to your Redistricting episode of The Wrap. I'm WRAL State Government Reporter Travis Fain.
And I am WRAL State Government Reporter Will Doran.
And we'll get into the week that was in North Carolina politics, but I think we're going to spend most of our time on redistricting with lawmakers drawing maps this week, as they have done more weeks of my life than I would like to remember, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, remember, we're only supposed to do this once a decade. After
Right.
each census comes out, you draw the maps, and then you use them for the next 10 years. Here, it's been about every 2 or 3 years, I think.
Yeah, fighting over what is and isn't constitutional, what a gerrymander is. But I mean, the case law is kind of settled now for the most part. There will be lawsuits over these newly filed maps, I'm sure, but the end result is less in question, I think, based on what the courts have done the last several years, which I don't know that we need to get into. Let's start with Thursday, the hearings that the House and Senate held on the maps that they had released Wednesday night. Out of the House hearings, I think the most interesting kind of little bit of news for insiders would be that a guy named Brian Springhetti out of Ohio was the consultant hired to draw just the House map, so the state House map, not the congressional maps and not the Senate map. But so, you know, who the consultant is and what they were told is always interesting. He was told to use election data from the past several cycles, and members were able to go back and forth with him about what they wanted to see. So that's kind of how the House map at least came together.
Yeah, it was a little bit different in the Senate committee that they had. It was just the senators themselves, they say, drawing the maps, and Democrats were trying to ask them questions about it, and the Senate Republican leaders kept saying, we're not going to answer that on advice of our counsel.
Right. And I mean, there's been these committee meetings happen, things were said in public, but there's been very little kind of chatting about this. Like, everybody is cognizant of the fact that this is all on the record, and they don't want to see what they say, on a bulletin board in the front of a federal court room as these lawsuits go forward. Schedule-wise, I'm a little confused as to what day everything's going to happen, but I think Monday and Tuesday you expect these maps to move through committee. Floor votes as early as Tuesday, probably finishing maps totally approved by Wednesday or soon thereafter of next week. Certainly law by the end of next week. The governor has no role in redistricting in North Carolina. It's nothing he can veto. It's just what the legislature passes.
Yeah, and as soon as they become law, there will be lawsuits suing them. There might even be lawsuits about them before they become law. That's what we saw in 2021. There were 3 or 4 lawsuits, and I think one of those actually happened before the maps were even official.
Yeah, and one thing that'll be interesting, this will proceed under a new law that deals with records related to redistricting. Y'all might remember that as part of the budget, Republican lawmakers basically exempted themselves from the State Open Records Act, but they also deleted from state code some language that has specifically made redistricting documents public record after the maps have passed. That is gone. So the question then becomes, well, what are you going to provide, not just from open records requests, but in the discovery process to attorneys? Destin Hall, the redistricting chairman in the House, when asked this, because Democrats questioned this repeatedly during the hearings, said, well, that's going to be up to members what they do and don't release. Senator Warren Daniel said, well, we'll take our lawyers' advice on that. So not exactly a promise of transparency there, Will.
No, and well, people who follow this closely will remember Hall personally kind of ran into this problem in the 2021 trial over gerrymandering. He said on the record that there was, some concept maps which probably should have been considered a public record that ended up just being destroyed before they could be used as evidence. So this new law just fixes that and makes sure that, when they destroy documents, it won't potentially run afoul of the law in the future.
That's right. I would also note ProPublica had a story this week about a trend on this nationally, and I'll quote from it. Through new and expansive assertions of privilege, Republican legislatures around the country are shielding their work on allegedly discriminatory voting maps to prevent the public from finding out how and why they made their decisions. So it's not just North Carolina. Quickly, I think because we've talked about them in stories, let's talk about the congressional maps. 2 maps, both drawn by the Senate. Kind of unclear. I think there's some disagreement between the House and Senate, so that these things could move a little bit, but probably not a lot. Both maps really pack Democrats into a handful of districts, creating multiple D+40 or D+50 districts, and spreading Republicans out so that districts lean comfortably Republican but are not so stilted toward Republican that you waste some of your Republican voters.
Right.
That could be better used in other districts. I know Republicans will say, well, that's because Democrats live in cities, but let's not pretend they're not taking advantage of that in order to go from what is a 7-7 map right now. We have 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats representing North Carolina in Congress, to one that's either 11-3 or 10-4 in favor of Republicans.
Right. And a good example of that, I think, is probably Charlotte. Right now there's 2 Charlotte congressional districts, 2 Democrats, Jeff Jackson and Alma Adams represent them. The new map gets rid of Jeff Jackson. And he has said as much. He came out with a video and said, I'm toast if these maps pass. And the new maps would have 3 Charlotte districts, and there would be 1 Democratic district still held by Alma Adams, and then 2 Republican-leaning districts. And the way they do that is you take Alma Adams district and take it from D+30 to now D+50 in the new maps, and stick all those Democrats into one district and spread out the slightly more conservative suburbs into a couple others.
Yeah, and I think what mystery remains in this process at the congressional level is what they do with NC1. That's Congressman Don Davis's district out in the Northeast. And then Valerie Foushee, is she 4?
She is, yeah.
So these are 2 Democrats that in one version of the proposed congressional maps would be double bunked. So only one of them could continue to be in Congress in that district. And then the other one, Foushee's district, would be a safe Democratic district. And then Davis's would be, if I remember it correctly, is like a fairly tight district. But at any rate,
it would be a competitive one,
and also one that may issue or lead to a VRA, Voting Rights Act challenge, because while partisan gerrymandering is allowed under both federal and state court precedents at this point, racial gerrymandering is not. And I've seen some commentary that Davis's district out again in the northeast of the state shrinks the black voting power, the percentages, by enough to trigger a VRA. But I mean, I guarantee you Republicans have thought this through. So
this is definitely, I think, what any lawsuits we see are going to be focusing on. And the top Senate leader, Dan Blue, mentioned this explicitly, saying he thought the congressional maps did violate the Voting Rights Act. Obviously, yeah, it'll probably get into the exact details of which precincts did or didn't make it into these, but both of the maps would target either Foushee or Davis, who are 2 of the state's 3 black representatives. Right now we have 3 out of 14 representatives are black, which is a little over 20%. The state's black population is also a little over 20%, so it's roughly proportional. But of course, if you go down to 2 of 14 in a state that remains over 20% black, then it becomes disproportional. So that could definitely be a key factor in any future lawsuits.
Speaking of the 1st District, I'll just mention quickly retired Colonel Lori Buckhout, I'm not sure, a Republican announced this week, said she's going to put in $1 million of her own money, retired from the Army in 2010, has a consulting firm that specializes in electronic warfare and cyberspace. I'm sure there are going to be other candidates in this race. She just happened to announce this week, so I thought we'd mention it. A couple of districts of note. There is a district that Tricia Cotham, the state representative in the House, who famously switched parties and gave the Republicans their narrow supermajority this session. She could run in the 8th or 9th congressional district, which would be safe Republican districts. She's also been moved. Her House district has been shifted around from one that was like a heavy blue district where only a Democrat's going to win to one where maybe a Republican. It's a tighter district, so it seemed like a favor there for her.
All throughout southern Mecklenburg County to make it as competitive as possible.
Also on Cotham, she has been in the hospital this week. She had jaw surgery. Apparently some sort of emergency arose stemming from the fact that she broke her jaw 20 years ago. She said this, I believe, on Facebook. So best wishes to her. Also in the Charlotte area, Tim Moore, Speaker of the House Tim Moore, who we know is retiring from the House, long thought he'd be a congressional candidate, and it would be the 14th district, it looks like, which is just to the west of Charlotte, essentially.
Yeah, even though there's 2 congressional maps with some different shaped districts, both of them have, I think, the exact same district. That's an open district with no incumbents, centered right around Tim Moore's house. So, who's going to run in that one? We'll have to see.
We'll see. Speaker Moore also been in the hospital this week, but visiting his father, who has had some health problems. So if you didn't see the Speaker around the building this week, the legislative building, That's why, and our best wishes go out to his family. Let's take a break real quick. When we come back, we'll break down the House map, the Senate map, the legislative maps, and talk about other things that happened this week in North Carolina politics. All right, welcome back to the wrap. Let's turn our attention, Will, to the state Senate map. Senator Natasha Marcus double bunked with Vicky Sawyer. Senator Lisa Grafstein double bunked with Jay Chaudhary here in Wake County. So a handful. There's going to be some turnovers. There always is in these maps. Mary Wills Bodie in Wake County, she has a tougher path to re-election under the proposed state Senate map. I believe that just about every or most of the districts that she won in Wake County have been replaced with fairly red districts. So, I mean, some people have some targets on their backs, I think is what I'm getting at here.
Absolutely. And obviously, Natasha Marcus, Lisa Grafstein in particular, have been two of the most outspoken Democrats opposing Republican priorities, especially on things like some of the anti-transgender bills we've seen this year, other kind of hot button issues. And so, obviously, Republicans would prefer it if they were no longer around to harangue them in their floor speeches. I
saw Grafstein say she might even move to continue running to run in the new district. So we'll wait and see on that. I'll mention something I saw Asher Hildebrand, who's a former David Price staffer. He's now over at Duke University, say on Twitter. If you hear people talk about county clusters or the Stevenson decision, the way districts are drawn in this state, and probably in other states too, I don't care about them, is based on past court precedents. The big one is the Stevenson case. And this county cluster is like certain counties, I'm not going to get into it, but it limits how you can draw districts. And
you're not supposed to break up counties. You need to do as much as you can to not cut counties in two.
Right. And so what Asher Hildebrand said was that this county cluster requirement creates a structural bias toward Republicans because of Republicans being more likely to live in rural areas. But it also acts as a modest constraint on gerrymandering since there's only so far you can go within each cluster. I thought that was interesting and something that maybe I understood kind of internally, but the way he put it I thought was instructive and helpful.
Yeah, no, that is very helpful to understanding that.
And the upshot for Asher Hildebrand, was that the legislative maps give the Republican Party a clear path to maintaining their supermajorities in both chambers, but without completely closing the door to Dems breaking that supermajority. I don't think there's anyone out there, Will, except the biggest star-eyed optimist Democrat who thinks Democrats could win an actual majority under these maps, or maybe any maps at this point.
Certainly not in 2024. Maybe if these maps still exist in 2028, 2030, if there continues to be massive growth in the urban areas and some of the suburbs, Democrats could have a shot then. But yeah, in the next few years, probably not.
Moving on to the House, that's 120 districts. It's harder to predict anything when there's more of them. You and I have been back and forth a little bit today about what we think is going to happen. Why don't you start with what you see in the numbers and what it means? So remember, Republicans won 71 seats in the last election in the state House. They moved to 72 because Cotham flipped, which 72 is a supermajority. So right. How close to 72 do you figure they get under these new maps?
So if these new maps had existed in 2022, instead of winning 71 seats, the Republicans would have won 73. And that was the year, obviously the midterm, Ted Budd won that race with roughly 51% of the vote statewide. So, Democrats are pointing to that saying, look, you've got, Republicans winning a supermajority over 60% of the seats, even if they're winning 50 to 51% of the statewide vote. But again, as you pointed out as Asher Hildebrand was saying with the county clusters that kind of favor Republicans have said the same thing. They say, look, this isn't because we're gerrymandering it. This is just because of the way the state's political geography works.
Another way to say it, an honest way to say it might be, it's not just because we're gerrymandering.
That's probably more accurate, yeah.
It's so tough to predict these things and boil them down. I just remember any number that you see, it depends on all these other numbers. People are making assumptions as they kind of try to predict it. Dave's Redistricting app is really a really powerful tool, but it takes into account, I think, 2016 through 2020 elections.
Yeah.
So not 2022, which has its own problems because it wasn't a presidential year, and nothing predicts the movement of population since then, and over the next 13 months as we head to the November 2024. We're a fast-growing state. I know of at least one district where Republican strategists are saying, well, yeah, the number says this district leans Republican, but Ted Budd lost it in 2022. We see this as like a Democratic district, even though the numbers indicate it leans Republican. So,
yeah, with the congressional lines, there really are going to be no surprises. They have drawn those very carefully to make sure that, whichever party's going to win is going to win. There's
I'm nodding my head.
Seats.
Definite yes here.
But with the state Senate, there might be a handful of competitive seats in future elections, but the House will have maybe half a dozen out of the 120 seats be competitive, maybe a few more, 8 or 9 potentially competitive seats in future elections. So there is some wiggle room for Democrats, especially if they're trying to break a supermajority in the future. Probably the state house is their best bet to do that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Anything more in redistricting before we move on to a couple of other things? I know we've got more notes here, but I feel like we've covered this.
Yeah, I don't think people want to hear about the Polsby-Popper scores and all those fun technical terms they throw out when they talk about these things.
The House, at least on its maps, did not use the various mathematical measurements. Their consultant, they said, was just told to keep them kind of like looking contiguous, looking compact, not contiguous, compact.
Yeah, a vibes-based approach.
I love it. Sticking with voting, 2 more lawsuits filed this week on Senate bills 747 and 749. These are the voting elections overhaul bills we've talked about several times. The lawsuit on 747 was filed by Democracy North Carolina, the League of Women Voters, and the North Carolina Black Alliance. The lawsuit on 749, that's the one that flips up the way the State Board of Elections is named. Governor Roy Cooper or his administrator, I guess Roy Cooper filed a lawsuit
yes,
against it,
yeah,
I assume in his capacity as governor.
Yeah, Cooper is suing to stop these changes that the legislature wants to make to the elections board. And, on paper, he's got a good argument. Basically, this exact same plan was ruled unconstitutional in 2017. It's not like it's ancient history. But the difference is the Supreme Court had a Democratic majority then, has a Republican majority now. GOP leaders have said explicitly that the reason they are trying this again is because they think they've got a better shot at winning in court.
Yeah, and they do. Did Newby dissent? Chief Justice Paul Newby, a Republican, I believe he was maybe the lone dissent on that case.
I think Mark Martin was around at that time too. I think actually, if I'm remembering correctly, I think Martin and Newby both wrote separate dissents in that case.
There you go, keeping it nice and simple for us. I want to highlight some journalism from some other folks this week on mental health. Taylor Knopf with the North Carolina Health News. She did a piece about how the state budget that passed recently, it's got a big section of policy changes for LME MCOs. These are organizations that do behavioral health, mental health care around the state. And they've been the subject of some back and forth, some complaining. The bottom line here from reading Taylor's story is that the budget is going to give the Secretary of Health and Human Services, that's Cody Kinsley in North Carolina, more control over these entities, and it's probably going to shrink the number of these entities, these kind of, I guess I would call them semi-private entities. I think they're nonprofits that have state contracts, government contracts to run these programs.
Right, for mental health care in particular.
So significant changes there. Gen X, second week in a row that I'll recommend a Lisa Sorg story to y'all from Lisa Sorg over at NC Newsline. The Keymores facility in Fayetteville, this is where Gen X and other PFAs, which are the forever chemicals that are in our water and in our blood and cause at least some health problems up to and including cancer. They've been allowed to import 4 million pounds from the company's Netherlands facility over the next year, according to an EPA letter authorizing the shipments. That's 220 times the amount exported in 2014. Lisa Sorg, a great environmental reporter, says that the State Department of Environmental Quality was unaware of this.
DEQ has been caught unaware with a lot of this Gen X stuff. They faced a lot of criticism when it was first discovered for not finding these spills and leaks and dumps earlier. There was also some other news with that exact same Chemours plant down in Fayetteville. Since 2017, a group of southeastern North Carolina residents has been trying to file a class action lawsuit against them. And earlier this month, a judge certified that class. And so that lawsuit is now moving forward. We should know more actually by the end of this month on what the schedule for the trial is going to look like. But, it's taken 6 years to even get to this point. So I don't think people should expect a super fast schedule when we see one.
And I'll just note here, as I've noted before, but it's helpful, I think, to say it out loud from time to time in this country. If you're a company making a new chemical of some kind, you don't have to prove it's safe before you put it out into the water and out into the environment. It has to be proven dangerous to stop you from doing it. So.
Yeah, and actually on that note, there was a really interesting part of the ruling. While the judge did rule for the potentially 100,000 or more people who want to be part of this class action lawsuit, he stopped them from doing kind of health studies in Southeast North Carolina, taking people's blood, which could have potentially, shown a link between PFAS and cancer or other issues. So that was, definitely a win for the companies, even if, they are now facing these big legal liabilities.
Yeah, environmental groups have been pushing for those studies for years at this point. So
not going to happen.
Turning our attention to childcare, to daycare, the Department of Health and Human Services put out a release, I believe today, Friday, about Southwestern Child Development. This is an entity that has a number of childcare centers. It's going to be closing 7 of them out in the western part of the state as of October 31st. These centers serve nearly 300 kids up to 5 years old. And I mention this because I think you should get used to seeing news like this. During the pandemic, the federal government put, I think, $24 billion into propping up the child care system because we were having trouble paying people enough to take care of people's children. And that has been a long-standing problem that was just, like so many things, exacerbated in the pandemic. All that money expired on September 30th. And there was a lot of talk at the state level and at the federal level of continuing that money, replacing that money, avoiding that cliff. It didn't happen. And so now you're going to see the Century Foundation has said recently that more than 70,000 child care programs around the country will likely close, 1,700 of those being in North Carolina. Obviously, those are predictions, not hard numbers, but just,
I mean, as someone with 2 young kids, it is insane right now to try to get on a waiting list for a daycare. And I can't imagine how much worse it'll get if 1,000 or more centers shut down. I mean, I know friends who've had to take a year off of work because, the daycare, they couldn't find a daycare with space for an infant. They said, well, we have room for a 1-year-old, so we'll take your kid when they turn 1.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a mystery to me, and I need to ask more people more questions about why Congress and the legislature did not get on board with funding this. It was something that the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce had very prominently was asking for. House Budget Writer Donnie Lambeth, I remember going to a press conference in February where he was recommending hundreds of millions of dollars, and it just didn't get included in the state budget. I remember talking to Senator Tom Tillis, I think in May, and saying, hey, do you think Congress will get on this? And he said, I think we will, and they didn't. And, of course, now we know what Congress is doing, which is, they're kind of just stuck in the mud as House Republicans fight over who's going to be their Speaker of the House.
Yeah, I don't think we need to get into the weeds with the whole Patrick McHenry situation from here in North Carolina.
Folks, in our show notes, it literally says, Patrick McHenry, do we have energy to talk about this? And I think the answer you're hearing is no, we don't.
You know what? There are, I'm sure, plenty of great national podcasts all about this, but we prefer people listen to the local news podcasts about what's happening in your backyard.
I'll also highlight a story from our colleague Emily Walkenhorst this week, based off an ACLU report. Schools and officers that work in them referred Black students and students with disabilities to law enforcement agencies about 2.5 times as often as white students. Also, disorderly conduct complaints, which are fairly minor. I mean, you think about it in a school capacity, it might be, sassing a teacher, raising your voice, disorderly conduct. It can be a lot of things. More than 4 times as often a Black student hit with a disorderly conduct complaint than white students. And this is part of the argument over what role police officers should play in our schools. Some people will argue that school resource officers are not a net positive, that it tends to criminalize behavior that should be dealt with in other ways, put more money toward nurses, toward counselors, et cetera. And that minority students bear the brunt of that. So I recommend the story to people.
Yeah, it's a really just long-term ongoing issue here in North Carolina that people have been struggling with for generations.
Yep. Yeah, and I'll Although I'll say, I mean, as a parent, hey, boy, it would be a tough call as an elected official to be able, let's get the police officers out of our schools. That is asking a lot. So I think more people look more at, well, let's not do that, but let's put more money toward counselors and nurses and stuff like that. People who can deal with problems so that cops do not have to become, the de facto counselor. Carolina Journal reporting, I think today, Greg Lindbergh, accused of bribing Insurance Commissioner Mike Causey years ago. He was convicted, and then the Fourth Circuit said there was kind of I hesitate to call it a technical problem, but they didn't say he didn't do things. They just said that the judge gave...
He needed a new trial.
Bad instructions to the jury. He's going to get a new trial, had been scheduled to begin in November. Now it's been pushed to April or May of next year. That is according to the Carolina Journal. Will, you got a piece coming this week and people probably ought to look at, particularly if they're state employees, right?
Yes. There are big changes coming that, from all I can tell, no one really knows about yet. With UNC Health and ECU Health, between them, they've got, I think, tens of thousands of employees. And starting in January, all of their new hires are going to be ineligible for the state retirement plan. And also all the current employees are going to have the option to leave the state retirement plan if they want and go on to new plans that these systems are coming up with. Now, what are those new plans, you ask? Great question. This starts in January. No idea what these new plans are going to look like. And actually, State Treasurer Dale Falwell is raising a lot of concerns about this. He's worried that there's actually a lot of ways to violate IRS rules, and he's concerned that ECU and UNC have not been working with his office to set up their new retirement plans in a way that will please the IRS and not get the entire state pension plan in trouble. He also says that, especially if a lot of the current employees do decide to leave the state retirement system and go on to their new systems, that could blow $1 billion hole, if not more, in the pension plan. Obviously, people who get their pensions, that's propped up by people who are currently working and paying into the system, and it's supposed to kind of continue in perpetuity. But if you suddenly have thousands of people drop out of that plan, especially, if it's doctors, nurses, people who make more money than, your average state worker, that could, really be troublesome for the stability of that plan. So not a ton of clarity on what those new plans are going to look like. And for the record, UNC and ECU say that Falwell's concerns are completely overblown, that they think this is actually going to save money for the state in the long run, and that, the legislature wouldn't have passed it into law if they thought that there was a reason to be concerned about it.
Legislature never passes bad ideas. I know that. WRAL.com on Sunday morning, if you want to learn more about that, you probably should. Finally, former state controller Linda Combs died this week. She was the controller from 2014 to 2022. I mean, she had a long career, too, at the federal level, holding all sorts of big-time offices. She was controller of the Office of Management and Budget under President George W. Bush, had a number of other positions in the government, 5 presidential appointments confirmed by the United States Senate under 3 presidents, Reagan, H.W. Bush, and W. Bush. So best wishes to her family.
Yeah.
And then finally, just end on a happier note, we quote Western Carolina's political scientist Chris Cooper quite a bit and have done so this week over redistricting, talked to him several times. Saw a tweet from him today. He's got a book coming out in 2024 titled Anatomy of a Purple State, a North Carolina Politics Primer. Congratulations to him. That sounds like something that our listenership is going to be interested in.
And you know what? It's great timing. We're going to be, right in the center of national attention yet again next year with the presidential race and our governor's race and everything else going on.
Well, I'd say I'm looking forward to it, but that'd be a lie, Will. So we'll... But register and vote. That's my advice. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and we'll get you caught up next week here on The Wrap.